For 15 years, Meredith Vaughn has lived with the crushing weight of a mother's worst nightmare. Her 2-year-old son vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a hole in her heart that no amount of wealth could fill. But on an ordinary evening in a small Georgia town, everything changes when she spots a street boy with hauntingly familiar eyes and a faded blue bracelet that she recognizes instantly. What begins as a chance encounter spirals into a dangerous pursuit of truth, as Meredith uncovers a sinister network of child trafficking hidden beneath the veneer of respectability. Now she must risk everything to reclaim what was stolen from her, while powerful forces will stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. How far would you go to find a child who was ripped from your arms? What would you sacrifice to bring them home? Follow our channel now for the full, heart-wrenching story that has viewers saying, "I couldn't stop watching until the very end." Like, comment, and share where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more incredible true stories to light. The setting sun cast long shadows over Cloverville, a small town tucked away in rural Georgia where everyone claimed to know each other's business, but where secrets still found ways to fester in the dark. The golden hour painted the worn rooftops and power lines hanging above the town's weekly market in hues of burnt orange and amber. It was the kind of beautiful evening that should have lifted spirits, but not for Meredith Vaughn. At 58, Meredith walked with shoulders hunched forward and eyes hidden behind designer sunglasses, a habit she'd maintained religiously since the tragedy 15 years ago. The disappearance of her only child, a 2-year-old boy who vanished without a trace, had hollowed her out. The police investigation had gone cold. The community's sympathy had eventually dried up. Even the annual coverage on the local news had dwindled to nothing more than occasional cold case mentions. But today, something felt different. A silent fire burned in her chest, an inexplicable tightness that made her steps slower, more deliberate. It was the same feeling she'd had on the morning her son disappeared, a mother's intuition screaming that something monumental was about to happen. "Just another Friday," she whispered to herself, clutching her Hermes handbag closer to her body as she passed the farmers selling the last of their produce. Despite her millions, inherited from her late husband's tech company and multiplied through shrewd investments, Meredith preferred to walk these streets rather than drive her luxury car. It was her penance, perhaps, to feel connected to the world that had continued spinning while hers had stopped dead. As she rounded the corner toward the central square, she saw him. A street boy no older than 12, with dirt-streaked cheeks and clothes that hung from his thin frame like hand-me-downs from a much larger child. In his arms, he cradled 2 smaller children. One appeared to be a toddler of maybe 3, and the other couldn't have been more than 18 months old. All 3 looked unwashed, with the hollow-eyed stare of the chronically hungry. "Please, ma'am," the boy called out to a passing woman who quickened her pace. "Anything for them to eat? They haven't had nothing since yesterday." His voice was raspy, exhausted, the voice of someone who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. But it wasn't his plea that made Meredith freeze mid-step, as though time itself had crystallized around her. It was the faded blue fabric bracelet on his wrist, frayed at the edges but unmistakable, identical to the one her sister had hand-woven for her son, the one he was wearing when he disappeared. Meredith's heart hammered against her ribcage with such violence that she pressed a hand to her chest. The world around her seemed to blur at the edges as her focus narrowed to that single point of blue on the boy's skinny wrist. And when he turned his head and their eyes met across the busy square, something electric passed between them. They were her son's eyes, the same unusual shade of hazel, almost amber in the right light, the same slight upward tilt at the corners. Without conscious thought, Meredith lurched forward. Her designer handbag slipped from her grasp, spilling its contents across the sidewalk. She didn't notice. She was already half running across the street, heedless of traffic. "Hey lady, watch it!" A teenage boy on a bicycle swerved to avoid her, nearly crashing into a lamppost. The commotion caught the street boy's attention. His eyes widened as he saw the well-dressed woman barreling toward him with the determination of someone possessed. In one fluid motion born of survival instinct, he gathered the 2 little ones closer and bolted. "Wait!" Meredith cried out, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please! The bracelet! Where did you get it?" But the boy was already disappearing down an alley between 2 storefronts, moving with remarkable speed despite the burden of the 2 children in his arms. Meredith tried to follow, but her leather loafers weren't made for running. She stumbled at the mouth of the alley, catching herself against the rough brick wall. By the time she righted herself, The children were gone. She stood there, breathing hard, aware of the curious stares from passers-by. A well-dressed, clearly wealthy woman chasing after street children wasn't a common sight in Cloverville. Slowly, she sank to her knees in the middle of the hot asphalt, heedless of her expensive linen pants. Something caught the light beside her, a small flash of blue. The bracelet must have fallen off in the boy's hasty retreat. With trembling fingers, Meredith picked it up. The pattern was unmistakable, the specialized knots her sister Emily had learned during her travels in South America, the specific sequence of lighter and darker blue threads. This wasn't just similar to her son's bracelet. It was the bracelet, the one Emily had made just days before she died in a car accident, the one Meredith had tied around her son's tiny wrist herself on that last morning, when she'd kissed his forehead and promised to be back from her meeting in time for lunch. 15 years of carefully constructed composure cracked like thin ice on a spring day. For the first time since the police had told her they were downgrading the search for her son, Meredith Vaughn wept openly, surrounded by strangers on a small town street as the last light of day faded into twilight. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Someone knelt beside her, a young woman with concern in her eyes. But Meredith couldn't speak, because the impossible had just happened. She had found her son, and in the same moment, lost him again. The Georgian mansion that Meredith Vaughn called home had always felt too large, its 14 rooms echoing with emptiness since the day her son disappeared. Tonight, as she pushed open the heavy oak door with trembling hands, it felt like a mausoleum. The bracelet clutched in her palm seemed to burn against her skin, a physical connection to the ghost that had haunted her for 15 years. "Miss Meredith, you're back early. I was just about to—" Miss Jones' voice died in her throat as she caught sight of Meredith's tear-streaked face. The elderly woman, who had been Meredith's nanny before becoming her housekeeper, dropped the feather duster she was holding. "Lord have mercy, what's happened?" Meredith couldn't speak. She simply extended her hand, revealing the frayed blue bracelet. Miss Jones' weathered face drained of color. Where did you find that?" "It was him, Joan." Meredith's voice was barely audible. "My boy. He's alive." She collapsed into a nearby armchair, her entire body shaking as the adrenaline drained away. Joan hurried to pour a finger of bourbon into a crystal tumbler, pressing it into Meredith's hands. "Now you listen to me," Joan said, her Georgia accent growing thicker as it always did in moments of stress. "You can't go jumping to conclusions. That bracelet could have ended up anywhere in 15 years. You know how many of those friendship bracelets kids wear nowadays?" Meredith shook her head vehemently. "This isn't some mass-produced trinket. Emily made it herself, with that special South American knotting technique she learned in Peru. It has the little imperfection where she had to tie off one thread and start with another." Her fingers traced the almost imperceptible bump in the weaving. "And his eyes, Joan. They were his eyes. Honey, grief plays tricks on us, makes us see things we want to see." "I'm not crazy," Meredith snapped, then immediately softened. "I'm sorry. It's just, you weren't there. This boy, he was so young, maybe 12, and he was holding 2 smaller children, begging for food. They looked so neglected, so afraid." Joan sank into the chair opposite Meredith, her arthritic hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Even if, and I'm not saying it is, but even if this boy had something to do with your Tommy, what does that mean? It's been 15 years, Meredith. 15 years of false leads and broken hopes." Meredith stared into the amber liquid in her glass. "I don't know what it means, but I'm going to find out." Sleep evaded her that night. Meredith paced her bedroom, the bracelet never leaving her hand. By dawn, she had formulated a plan. She would return to the town square and ask every shopkeeper, every vendor, anyone who might have seen the boy and the 2 children. As the first light of morning filtered through the Georgian pines that surrounded her estate, Meredith dressed with purpose. No designer clothes today. She chose jeans, a plain button-down shirt, and comfortable walking shoes. She tied her silver-streaked hair back in a simple ponytail and deliberately left her jewelry box untouched. If she wanted information from the working-class heart of Cloverville, she needed to blend in, not intimidate. Miss Joan watched with worry etched on her face as Meredith prepared a simple breakfast. "You're really going through with this?" the older woman asked. Meredith nodded, determined. "I have to know, Joan. One way or another." By 8 a.m., Meredith was back at the town square, which was already bustling with the Friday farmers market. She approached a gruff-looking man setting up his vegetable stand. "Excuse me," she began. "There was a young boy here yesterday, about 12, with 2 smaller children. He was asking for food. Do you know who I'm talking about?" The vendor barely glanced up. "Lady, there's all sorts of folks come through here." Undeterred, Meredith moved on to the next stall, and the next. Most people gave her the same dismissive response until she approached an elderly man selling homemade preserves. "The boy with the little ones?" he said, adjusting his worn baseball cap. "Yeah, I seen him. Poor kids. Been coming round on Fridays for a couple months now. Never the same time, though. Sometimes morning, sometimes afternoon." Meredith's heart quickened. "Always Fridays? You're sure?" "Yep. Market days. Makes sense, I reckon. More people around. Better chance of handouts." She thanked him with such genuine gratitude that the old man blushed and insisted she take a jar of his peach jam. No charge. As Meredith moved away, clutching the jar, she noticed a police officer watching her from across the square. Something in his gaze made her uneasy. When their eyes met, he immediately approached her with measured steps. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Officer Daniels, everything all right? Heard you've been asking about some street kids." There was something in his tone, not concern but warning, that raised the hairs on the back of Meredith's neck. "Just trying to help," she replied carefully. They looked hungry. Officer Daniels studied her face for a moment too long. "Best to leave that to the proper authorities. Street kids can be complicated. Sometimes they're not what they seem." Before Meredith could respond, the officer continued, "We don't need folks stirring up trouble or getting ideas about children that aren't theirs to worry about. Understand?" The implied threat hung in the air between them. Meredith nodded slowly, maintaining eye contact. "Perfectly," she said. As the officer walked away, an elderly woman who had been arranging handmade quilts at a nearby stall leaned toward Meredith. "That boy," she whispered. "He first showed up here about 4 months ago. With a woman. Young thing looked scared out of her wits. Then she just disappeared and he started coming with those babies instead." The woman glanced nervously in the direction the officer had gone. "Nobody asks questions around here. Not anymore." The woman turned back to her quilts, effectively ending the conversation. But Meredith stood frozen, her blood running cold despite the Georgia heat. Something was very wrong in Cloverville, and somehow, her son was at the center of it all. The week crawled by like molasses in January, each minute stretching into what felt like hours as Meredith waited for Friday to arrive again. She'd barely slept, her dreams haunted by the boy's amber eyes and the 2 small children in his arms. Every morning she woke with her heart pounding, the blue bracelet clutched in her palm where she'd fallen asleep holding it. Miss Joan had tried reasoning with her, suggesting that perhaps she should contact the authorities. But the memory of Officer Daniels' veiled warning kept Meredith silent. There was something off about the way he'd approached her, something calculated in his eyes that made her instincts scream danger. When Friday finally dawned, Meredith was already awake, watching the sunrise paint the Georgian sky in delicate strokes of pink and gold. She dressed carefully, not too shabby to attract attention, but not so polished as to stand out. A pair of worn jeans, a faded University of Georgia t-shirt that had belonged to her late husband, and a baseball cap to shield her face. In her pocket, she carried the blue bracelet, her fingers constantly reaching to touch it, as if to reassure herself it was real. She arrived at the town square as the farmers were setting up their stalls, the early morning air still crisp with the lingering coolness of night. The elderly man who sold preserves nodded in recognition as she passed. "Ain't seen them yet," he offered without her asking. Meredith thanked him with a tight smile and positioned herself on a bench that offered a clear view of the square's 4 entrances. And then she waited. The morning sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly on the asphalt. By noon, the temperature had soared to a stifling 95 degrees, humidity making the air feel thick enough to slice. Meredith's shirt clung to her back with sweat, and her throat was parched despite the bottle of water she'd brought. Still, she waited. Lunch hour came and went. The market reached its peak of activity, then gradually began to wind down. Vendors started packing away unsold goods. The elderly man with the preserves stopped by her bench on his way out. "Sometimes they come late," he said, handing her a fresh bottle of water from his cooler. "After most folks have gone home. Less eyes that way." Meredith nodded gratefully, both for the water and the information. The old man hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "If you're really looking to help those kids, Be careful. Things ain't always what they seem round here. It was the second warning she'd received, but unlike Officer Daniels, this one felt genuine. Before she could ask what he meant, the man had already moved on, his arthritic gait carrying him slowly toward the parking lot. The afternoon stretched into evening. The square emptied except for a few teenagers lounging by the central fountain, smoking cigarettes and laughing too loudly. Meredith's head throbbed from the heat and hunger, but she refused to leave. Not yet. Not until she was absolutely certain they wouldn't come. The streetlights flickered on, casting pools of yellow light across the empty square. The teenagers had departed, leaving behind only cigarette butts and empty soda cans. Meredith checked her watch, 9:47 p.m. She'd been sitting there for over 14 hours. Just as she was about to admit defeat, a sound caught her attention. A child's whimper, quickly hushed. Her head snapped up, eyes scanning the darkened perimeter of the square. There, emerging from the shadows between two buildings, was the boy. He moved cautiously, his thin frame hunched protectively around the two smaller children. One of them, the smallest, who couldn't have been more than 18 months old, was fussing, tiny hands pushing against the boy's chest. "Shh, Lily, please," she heard him whisper, his voice carrying in the still night air. "Just a little bit longer, I promise." With trembling hands, the boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled bag of expired cheese puffs. The sight of the child attempting to feed a crying toddler with stale snacks made Meredith's heart constrict painfully. Slowly, careful not to startle them, she stood from her bench. The boy's head jerked up, his eyes widening as he recognized her from the week before. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the empty square, the wealthy woman and the street child, connected by an invisible thread that neither fully understood. Meredith took a tentative step forward. The boy didn't run this time, though his body tensed, ready for flight. Another step, then another. She was close enough now to see the exhaustion etched in his young face, the fear and wariness in those hauntingly familiar eyes. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly, holding her hands up to show they were empty. "I just want to help." The boy's eyes narrowed with suspicion born of harsh experience. "We don't need help," he replied, but his voice wavered, betraying him. Before Meredith could respond, the sudden slam of a car door shattered the quiet. A dark sedan had pulled up at the edge of the square, its engine still running. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out, tall, with broad shoulders and a military-style crew cut. "Jason," he barked, his voice hard as flint. "Get in the car. Now." The transformation in the boy was instantaneous and heartbreaking. His shoulders hunched further, and he seemed to physically shrink, as if trying to disappear into himself. The smaller children burrowed against him, sensing the change in their protector. Meredith stepped between the boy and the approaching man without thinking. "Who are you?" she demanded. The man stopped, clearly surprised by her interference. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with cold eyes and a set jaw. "This isn't your business, lady," he said, his tone dismissive. "These are my kids. We're going home." "They're not your kids." The words flew from Meredith's mouth before she could stop them. The man's expression hardened dangerously. "You calling me a liar?" His hand moved toward his pocket, and though he didn't withdraw anything, the implied threat hung in the air between them. "Maybe I should call the police, have them sort this out. Officer Daniels is a personal friend of mine." At the mention of Officer Daniels, a flicker of understanding passed between Meredith and the boy. She saw it in his eyes, a confirmation of her suspicions that something was deeply wrong here. "Please," the boy said suddenly, grabbing her arm. His touch sent an electric shock through Meredith's body, the first physical contact with the child she believed might be her son. "Don't make trouble, he'll hurt her." He nodded toward the smallest child, who was watching the exchange with wide, frightened eyes. The plea in his voice, the protective way he clutched the children closer, Meredith felt something break inside her. She stepped aside, every maternal instinct screaming in protest. The man smirked, victory written across his face. "Smart lady. Let's go, Jason." As the boy passed her, head bowed in defeat, Meredith whispered, "I'll come back. I promise." He didn't acknowledge her words, but she saw his grip tighten on the smaller children, a silent vow of his own. Meredith stood rooted to the spot as they climbed into the sedan. Just before the door closed, she memorized the license plate, repeating the numbers and letters in her mind like a mantra. The car pulled away, taillights disappearing into the Georgia night. But this time, Meredith wasn't left empty-handed. She had a name, Jason, and a license plate. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and she had made a promise she intended to keep no matter the cost. The license plate number burned in Meredith's mind as she drove her rarely used Mercedes through the rain-slicked streets of Atlanta. The wipers beat a frantic rhythm against the downpour, matching her thundering heart. After a sleepless night, she'd made a decision that would change everything. She needed professional help. Nathaniel Bridges' private investigation firm occupied the third floor of a nondescript office building in downtown Atlanta. A former FBI agent with a reputation for discretion and an impressive track record with missing persons cases, he'd been recommended by one of Meredith's business associates. The man himself was nothing like she'd expected. In his early 60s with salt and pepper hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a cardigan that made him look more like a college professor than a hardened investigator. "This license plate," Meredith said, sliding a piece of paper across his desk. "I need to know everything about it. The owner, the address, everything." Bridges studied her face before picking up the paper. "May I ask why?" Meredith hesitated. How much should she reveal? The wild hope that had kept her awake for days now seemed fragile when exposed to the harsh light of a stranger's skepticism. "My son disappeared 15 years ago," she finally said. "I believe he's alive and somehow connected to this car." She expected the usual pitying look, the gentle suggestion that perhaps she was grasping at straws. Instead, Bridges simply nodded. "I'll need a retainer," he said. "$5,000 to start. My hourly rate is—" "Money is no object," Meredith interrupted, already reaching for her checkbook. "But time is. How quickly can you get me information?" "Give me 24 hours. True to his word, Bridges called the next day. His voice was carefully neutral when he asked Meredith to come to his office immediately. The drive back to Atlanta felt endless. Every red light an unbearable delay. "The vehicle is registered to an organization called Second Chance Adoptions," Bridges said without preamble when Meredith entered his office. "It's a private adoption agency based in Cloverville, operating for about 12 years now." He slid a manila folder across his desk. Inside were printouts of a website showing smiling couples holding babies, testimonials from grateful adoptive parents, and a staff directory. Meredith's eyes fixed on one name, Executive Director, Darlene Morrison. The room seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "Sister Darlene," she whispered. Bridges raised an eyebrow. "You know her?" "She was—" Meredith swallowed hard. "She used to run St. Catherine's Home for Children, an orphanage. It was shut down about 6 months after my son disappeared." "Why was it closed?" "Officially? Financial mismanagement. But there were rumors. Children being adopted under questionable circumstances. Records falsified." Meredith's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. "I never connected it to Tommy's disappearance because he wasn't an orphan. He was taken from our backyard while Miss Joan was gardening." Bridges leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Sometimes the most obvious connection isn't the right one. What does your gut tell you now?" "That Sister Darlene, or whatever she calls herself these days, knows what happened to my son." The investigator nodded, pulling another document from his desk drawer. "There's more. I did a deep background check on Second Chance Adoptions. On paper, they're legitimate, licensed by the state, all the proper certifications. But their finances are interesting." He pointed to a series of highlighted transactions. Large cash deposits every few months, much larger than standard adoption fees would account for, and withdrawals to offshore accounts. The implication hung in the air between them. Meredith felt sick. "Are you suggesting they're selling children?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Bridges replied carefully. "But I think we need to look deeper." A knock at the door interrupted them. Bridges' assistant poked her head in. "There's someone here to see Ms. Vaughn. Says it's urgent. A young woman named Ellie Ramirez." Meredith frowned. "I don't know anyone by that name." "She says it's about Jason." The name sent a jolt through Meredith's body. She nodded, and moments later, a young woman entered, early 20s, petite, with dark hair pulled into a severe ponytail and eyes that darted nervously around the room. "How do you know Jason?" Meredith demanded, rising from her chair. Ellie twisted her hands together. "I was like him, one of Sister Darlene's special cases." Her voice was bitter. "I was adopted through St. Catherine's when I was 4. At least that's what my parents were told. There were no records, no birth certificate, just me and a made-up story about my mother dying in childbirth. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a photograph, laying it on the desk. It showed a group of children standing in front of an institutional-looking building. This was taken at St. Catherine's a month before it closed. That's me. She pointed to a solemn-faced little girl in the front row. And that, her finger moved to a small boy clutching a teddy bear, is Tommy Vaughn. Meredith gasped, snatching up the photo. The child was unmistakably her son, down to the cowlick in his hair and the tiny scar above his left eyebrow from a fall when he was learning to walk. And on his wrist, clearly visible, was the blue bracelet. "How did you find me?" she whispered. "I recognized you from the old news reports when you came asking questions in the square. Word travels fast in Cloverville." Ellie's eyes hardened. "But you need to be careful. Sister Darlene has powerful friends. And the children who go through second-chance adoptions? There are no records, no paper trails. It's like they never existed in the first place." "But why?" Meredith's voice cracked. "Why would they take my son? We weren't poor, we could provide for him." "It was never about helping children," Ellie cut in. "It was about profit. Sister Darlene has connections with wealthy families who want to adopt but don't want to wait, don't want to answer questions or have specific requests." Bridges, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. "Do you have any proof of this?" Ellie reached into her bag and pulled out an old cassette tape. "This is from Sister Darlene's office at St. Catherine's. The night before they closed, I snuck in and took it. I was too young to understand what it meant then, but I kept it hidden." Her hands trembled slightly. "I think you should listen to it, Ms. Vaughn, but not here, somewhere safe." As Meredith stared at the unmarked tape, a cold certainty settled in her bones. Whatever was recorded there would change everything, and there would be no going back. "There's one more thing you should know," Ellie added, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Officer Daniels, the one who's been warning people away from asking questions, he's Darlene Morrison's brother." The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture so dark and twisted that Meredith could barely comprehend it. But one thing was crystal clear. Her son was alive, and he was in danger. "Thank you, Ellie," she said, carefully placing the tape and photograph in her purse. "You've taken an enormous risk coming here." The young woman's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "They stole our lives, Ms. Vaughn. Someone needs to make them pay." As they left Bridges' office, neither woman noticed the black sedan parked across the street, or the man inside speaking urgently into a cell phone. The rain had intensified by the time Meredith and Ellie arrived at the Vaughn estate, battering the windows like angry fists demanding entry. Thunder rolled across the Georgia sky, lightning briefly illuminating the grand house that had felt like a mausoleum for 15 years. It seemed fitting somehow that the heavens themselves were in turmoil on the night Meredith might finally hear her son's voice again. Miss Joan greeted them at the door, her lined face creased with concern. "I've been worried sick," she admonished, taking in Ellie's presence with a questioning glance. "Joan, this is Ellie," Meredith explained, her voice tight with tension. "She has information about Tommy." The elderly woman's hand flew to her mouth. "Lord in heaven," she whispered, then recovering her composure. "You both look half drowned. Come on in. I'll make some tea." In Meredith's study, with its leather-bound books and antique furniture, the cassette tape looked incongruously small and ordinary. Meredith's hands trembled as she reached for the vintage cassette player that had belonged to her late husband, one of the few possessions she'd never been able to part with. "I've never actually listened to it," Ellie admitted, perched on the edge of an armchair. "I was too afraid. All I know is that it was labeled special cases and kept in Sister Darlene's locked desk drawer." Meredith inserted the tape with the care one might use handling a live explosive. The room fell silent except for the storm outside and the soft mechanical whir of the player. She pressed play. Static crackled through the speakers, then a woman's voice. Smooth, professional, with a hint of a southern accent. "Case number 47. Thomas Vaughn. Acquisition date, May 12, 2010. Age at acquisition, 2 years, 3 months. Meredith's knees buckled. Miss Joan quickly moved to her side, supporting her with a firm grip on her elbow. The voice continued, clinical and detached. Subject matches specifications for the Henderson request. Fair complexion, hazel eyes, above average intelligence indicators, blood type O negative, confirmed, medical screening clear. No identifying birthmarks or scars except minor laceration above left eyebrow. Easily explainable. Current market value, $250,000. Dear God, Miss Joan whispered, her face ashen. There was a pause on the tape, followed by shuffling sounds and what might have been a door opening. Then, a child's voice. Small, frightened, with the slight lisp that Meredith remembered so vividly it was like a physical pain in her chest. Mama, eu tô com frio. Mamãe, você volta amanhã? It was Portuguese, the language Meredith had spoken to Tommy since infancy, a tribute to her Brazilian heritage. Mommy, I'm cold. Mommy, will you come back tomorrow? The same phrase he had said every night before bed, his special way of asking her to tuck him in the following evening. Their private ritual. The tape continued with the sound of a child crying, muffled as if someone had covered a microphone. Then Sister Darlene's voice again. Subject continues to ask for mother in Portuguese. Recommend accelerated conditioning and language immersion before placement. Estimated time frame to compliance. 3 months. The tape clicked off. In the sudden silence, Meredith's ragged breathing sounded unnaturally loud. Her entire body was shaking, tears streaming unchecked down her face. They stole him, she whispered. They stole my baby and sold him like merchandise. The enormity of it was almost incomprehensible. Not just Tommy's abduction, but the systematic nature of it. Case number 47. How many other children had been acquired? How many other families destroyed? Miss Jones' weathered face had hardened into something fierce and terrible. That woman will burn in hell for this. Hell's too good for her, Ellie said quietly. She needs to face justice here first. Meredith straightened, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Grief and shock were giving way to a cold, crystalline anger that cleared her mind like a winter frost. We need to take this to the authorities, she said. Not local. They're compromised. FBI, perhaps. And say what? Ellie challenged. That a cassette tape from 15 years ago proves a respected adoption agency director kidnapped your son? We need more evidence. She's right, Miss Joan agreed reluctantly. That tape alone won't be enough. And if Officer Daniels is involved, then we get the evidence ourselves, Meredith decided, her voice taking on a hardness none of them had ever heard before. Starting with proof that Jason is Tommy. The following morning found Meredith at Officer Daniels' precinct, dressed in her most expensive suit, hair perfectly coiffed, the very picture of wealthy entitlement. The transformation from the broken woman of the previous night was remarkable, a mask so convincing that even Miss Joan had been startled by it. I'd like to speak with Officer Daniels, please, she told the desk sergeant, her tone suggesting that denial wasn't an option. Daniels emerged from a back office moments later, his face carefully neutral as he recognized her. Ms. Vaughn, what can I do for you? I owe you an apology, she said, the lie flowing smoothly. You were right about those street children. I should have left well enough alone. A flicker of suspicion crossed his features before being replaced by smug satisfaction. Glad to hear it. We know what's best for this community. Indeed, which is why I've decided to make a substantial donation to the Police Benevolent Fund. She removed an envelope from her purse. $20,000. A small token of appreciation for all you do. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. Greed battled caution on his face. That's very generous. I'm a generous woman. When properly motivated. Meredith leaned closer, lowering her voice confidentially. Between us, I'm considering a much larger donation to Second Chance Adoptions. Sister Darlene's work sounds fascinating. The mention of Darlene's name caused a nearly imperceptible tensing in Daniel's shoulders. My sister would appreciate that, he said carefully. Her organization does important work. I'd love to discuss it further, perhaps over dinner, this Friday. The invitation caught him off guard. He studied her face, searching for deception and finding only what she wanted him to see. A wealthy, lonely widow with money to burn and a desire to belong. I think that could be arranged, he finally said. Back in her car, Meredith allowed herself a moment of disgust before calling Ellie. He took the bait, she reported. Now for phase 2. While she kept Officer Daniels distracted with dinner plans and donation discussions, Ellie would be collecting samples from Jason and the children for DNA testing. A risky plan, fraught with potential disaster, but with her son's life at stake, Meredith was willing to risk everything. What she didn't know was that the blood test would reveal something even more shocking than she could have imagined. Friday morning arrived with the weight of a funeral procession. Meredith sat in her parked Mercedes a block away from the town square, sunglasses concealing the dark circles under her eyes from another sleepless night. Her stomach churned with anxiety as she watched the market slowly come to life, vendors setting up their stalls under the pink-gold light of dawn. Ellie slid into the passenger seat, her face tense with determination. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, glancing at the medical kit tucked beneath the dash. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Meredith replied, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. The plan was deceptively simple, born of desperation, and refined over endless cups of coffee in Meredith's kitchen. Ellie would intercept Jason and the children when they arrived at the market, while Meredith kept Officer Daniels occupied with a lunch meeting to discuss her generous donation to Second Chance Adoptions. Meanwhile, Nathaniel Bridges would be waiting at a private medical clinic on the outskirts of town, one owned by a former client who owed him a significant favor. "Remember," Meredith cautioned, "the smallest child first. Tommy, Jason, is protective of her. Offer food, gain his trust." Ellie nodded, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "And the swabs? Quick and painless. Tell him it's a requirement for the free clinic. Checking for strep throat that's going around." Meredith pressed a paper bag into Ellie's hands. "Fresh sandwiches, fruit and cookies. No child can resist Miss Jones' chocolate chip cookies." As Ellie slipped out of the car and walked toward the square, Meredith fought the urge to call her back, to abort the whole risky plan. What if they were caught? What if Officer Daniels somehow discovered their scheme? The consequences would be devastating, not just for her, but for the children they were trying to help. But the memory of Tommy's voice on that tape, "Maman, you took him free you," steeled her resolve. She had failed to protect him once. She would not fail again. At precisely 11:30, Meredith entered the Magnolia Cafe, the only upscale restaurant in Cloverville. Officer Daniels was already waiting, uncomfortably formal in a pressed uniform, looking distinctly out of place among the white tablecloths and crystal water glasses. "Miss Vaughn," he greeted her, rising awkwardly. "Thank you for the invitation." Meredith smiled with practiced charm, sliding into the chair across from him. "Please, call me Meredith. After all, we're discussing a partnership of sorts, aren't we?" Daniels's eyes gleamed with barely disguised avarice as Meredith spoke of endowments and charitable foundations, hinting at figures that made his annual salary look like pocket change. All the while, her phone remained in her lap, silent, torturously silent. No word from Ellie. "What exactly is your interest in Second Chance Adoptions?" Daniels asked finally between bites of overcooked steak. "You don't seem like the typical supporter." Meredith had prepared for this question, crafting a story that would play to his prejudices and suspicions. "Let's just say I understand the need for discretion in certain situations. There are children who need homes, and families willing to provide them. Sometimes the usual channels are too restrictive." Daniel studied her face, searching for any hint of deception. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he leaned forward conspiratorially. "My sister has helped a lot of families who couldn't navigate the red tape of traditional adoption. People with money but maybe a few issues in their background checks or who don't want to wait years for a placement." His voice lowered further. "She provides a valuable service, one that operates best without excessive scrutiny." It took every ounce of Meredith's self-control not to reach across the table and strangle him with his own tie. Instead, she nodded sympathetically, playing the role of complicit co-conspirator. Just as Daniels began elaborating on the special cases that Second Chance handled, Meredith's phone vibrated. A text from Ellie. "Got them. All three. Heading to clinic now." Relief flooded through her, so intense she nearly gasped aloud. Instead, she discreetly silenced the phone and redoubled her efforts to keep Officer Daniels talking and distracted. 2 excruciating hours later, Meredith finally extricated herself from lunch, promising to have her accountant draw up donation paperwork the following week. She drove exactly 5 miles per hour over the speed limit toward the clinic, fast enough to make good time, not fast enough to attract attention. Bridges was waiting in the parking lot, his normally stoic expression troubled. "They're inside," he said without preamble. "The doctor's examining them now. And the tests? DNA swabs are processing. We'll have preliminary results in about an hour. The doctor is rushing them. But there's something else you should know." Bridges hesitated, something Meredith had never seen him do before. "The children. They're malnourished, especially the little ones. And there are bruises. Old ones, new ones. A cold fury settled in Meredith's chest. "I'll kill them," she whispered. "Every last one of them who hurt those babies." Inside the clinic, Ellie sat with the 3 children in a private waiting room. Jason, she couldn't think of him as Tommy, not yet, sat rigidly on a plastic chair, his thin arm protectively around the smallest child. The middle one, a boy of about 4, was coloring quietly on the floor with crayons and paper provided by the clinic staff. "This is Mrs. Vaughn," Ellie introduced her. "She's the one who bought you lunch." Jason's eyes, those hauntingly familiar hazel eyes, assessed Meredith with a wariness that broke her heart. No child should be so guarded, so suspicious of adult kindness. "Thank you," he said finally, the words forced out as if they cost him something. Lily really needed to eat. The smallest child, nestled against Jason's side, looked up at the sound of her name. She couldn't have been more than 18 months old, with huge brown eyes and wispy blonde hair. Despite the circumstances, she offered Meredith a shy smile that pierced her soul. "You're very good with them," Meredith said carefully, sitting in a chair across from Jason, giving him space. "Are they your brother and sister?" A flicker of something, confusion, fear, crossed his face. "Sort of," he replied vaguely. Before Meredith could probe further, the doctor entered, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a serious expression. She nodded to Meredith, then addressed Jason directly. "I've got some medicine for Lily's cough," she said, handing him a small bottle. "And vitamins for all of you. You need to take them every day, okay?" Jason accepted the medicine with the practiced care of someone far older than his years. "Yes, ma'am." The doctor then turned to Meredith. "May I speak with you privately for a moment?" In the hallway, the doctor's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "Those children need intervention," she said bluntly. "The baby has early signs of rickets from vitamin D deficiency. The middle child shows indicators of developmental delays consistent with neglect. And the oldest," she shook her head, "he's functioning as their caregiver clearly, but he's just a child himself." "What about the DNA results?" Meredith pressed. "That's why I needed to speak with you." The doctor hesitated. "It's a match. 99.9% probability that the boy is your biological son." Despite having suspected, known, this in her heart, hearing the scientific confirmation made Meredith's knees buckle. The doctor caught her arm, steadying her. "There's more," she continued. "The smallest child, Lily, her DNA shows a familial match to you as well. She's almost certainly your granddaughter." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "My granddaughter?" Meredith whispered. "But that would mean that your son is her father, yes. Biologically, at least." The implications were staggering, horrifying. Tommy, Jason, couldn't be more than 17. For him to have fathered a child, "The police need to be involved," the doctor said firmly. "These children need to be removed from their current situation immediately." Meredith's mind raced. Police involvement meant questions, investigations, things that would alert Sister Darlene and Officer Daniels before they could secure evidence of the broader trafficking ring. "What if there was another option?" she asked slowly. "What if I could get them away safely tonight without alerting their abusers?" The doctor frowned. "That would be kidnapping, technically, even if you are his biological mother." "And what they did to him wasn't?" Meredith countered, her voice rising. "They stole my son, erased his identity, and have been exploiting him and those children for God knows how long." A tense silence stretched between them, broken by the buzz of Bridges' phone. His face darkened as he read the message. "What is it?" Meredith demanded. "The man you saw with the kids at the square, the one who drives the car. He's been found dead. Gunshot to the head in a motel outside town. Police are calling it suicide." Meredith felt the blood drain from her face. "They're cleaning house. They know we're onto them." The doctor looked between them, confusion giving way to alarm. "What exactly is happening here?" "There's no time to explain," Bridges said grimly. "But those children are in immediate danger, and they need to disappear now." In that moment, facing the most impossible ethical dilemma of her life, Meredith made her choice. She would take the children, all 3 of them, and run. But as she turned to re-enter the waiting room, she found the door open and Jason standing there, his face pale but resolute. "I heard everything," he said quietly, "and I need to know the truth. Are you really my mother?" The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on Meredith's Mercedes as it sped down the interstate, carrying a cargo more precious than gold. In the rearview mirror, she could see Tommy, his face turned toward the window, watching the landscape blur past with an expression both wary and wonderstruck. Beside him, the 4-year-old boy, whom they'd learned was named Michael, slept with his head against Tommy's shoulder. Little Lily was secured in a hastily purchased car seat, babbling quietly to herself. "How much further?" Ellie asked from the passenger seat, constantly checking the side mirrors for any sign of pursuit. "Another hour to the safe house," Bridges replied from the back where he sat next to the children. The former FBI agent had called in every favor he was owed, securing them a remote cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains owned by a trusted friend. No one knows about it, not even my assistant. The decision to flee had been made in a heartbeat after the news of the suicide. Whatever complex operation Sister Darlene was running, she was clearly eliminating loose ends. The children weren't safe, and neither was anyone helping them. Tommy had listened in stunned silence as Meredith confirmed what the DNA test had revealed, that she was his biological mother, that he had been stolen as a toddler, that his entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. He hadn't broken down, hadn't cried, hadn't shown any emotion at all beyond a slight trembling of his hands. His only question had been chillingly pragmatic for a 17-year-old. "Can you keep them safe, Michael and Lily?" Now, as they headed toward temporary sanctuary, Meredith was acutely aware that while she had found her son, she remained a stranger to him. 15 years of separation had created a gulf between them that no amount of shared DNA could instantly bridge. "We'll need to stop for supplies," Bridges noted, checking his watch. "Food, clothes for the kids, diapers for the little one. There's a Walmart 3 exits ahead," Ellie suggested. "I can run in while you all wait in the car." Meredith nodded agreement, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. Every mile they drove took them further from Cloverville, but she couldn't shake the feeling that danger was following close behind. They made the stop quickly, with Ellie returning in under 20 minutes, arms laden with bags. Back on the road, Meredith tried to focus on the practical matters at hand, rather than the emotional tsunami threatening to overwhelm her. "Once we're settled at the cabin, I'll contact my attorney," she said. "We'll need legal representation when we take this to the federal authorities." Bridges made a non-committal sound. "Given what we're dealing with, a potential interstate trafficking ring with law enforcement involvement, this needs to go straight to the FBI. But we need more evidence than a 15-year-old cassette tape and DNA tests. We need documentation, witnesses." "What about me?" Ellie spoke up. "I can testify about St. Catherine's, about what happened to me." "Your testimony would help," Bridges acknowledged. "But Sister Darlene has had years to build her cover story. She's respected in the community, running what appears to be a legitimate adoption agency. We're making serious accusations against powerful people." From the back seat came a quiet voice. "I know where she keeps her records." All heads turned to Tommy, who was staring straight ahead, his face a mask of controlled emotion. "The real ones, not the fake files they show to inspectors. She has a hidden office at the back of the Second Chance building. There's a safe behind a painting of Jesus." His voice was flat, detached, as if he were describing something he'd seen in a movie rather than lived. "That's where she keeps the blue folders, the ones with the children's real names and where they came from." The car filled with a heavy silence as the adults absorbed the implications of his words. "How do you know this?" Meredith finally asked, her voice gentle. Tommy's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror for a brief moment before sliding away. "Because sometimes I was the one who put them there. She said I was trustworthy." The word hung in the air between them, bitter and accusatory. Meredith understood what he wasn't saying, that Sister Darlene had manipulated him, used him, made him complicit in her crimes to ensure his silence. "It's not your fault," she said fiercely. "None of this is your fault." Tommy didn't respond, turning his gaze back to the window, effectively ending the conversation. They reached the cabin as dusk was settling over the mountains, painting the sky in strokes of lavender and deep orange. It was a simple structure: 2 bedrooms, a combined living and kitchen area, and a small bathroom. But it felt secure, isolated from the world by dense forest on all sides. As Ellie and Bridges brought in supplies and settled the younger children, Meredith found Tommy standing alone on the small porch, staring up at the emerging stars. "We used to do this," she said softly, moving to stand beside him. "Stargazing. You loved the constellations, even though you were too young to really understand them. You called the Big Dipper the soup spoon in the sky. Tommy's shoulders tensed, but he didn't walk away. I don't remember, he said after a long moment. I don't remember you at all. The words cut deeper than any knife could have, but Meredith forced herself to remain steady. That's okay, she assured him. You were only 2 when they took you. I remember enough for both of us. Inside the cabin, Lily began to cry, a high, distressed wail that had Tommy immediately turning to go to her. She needs her medicine, he explained, brushing past Meredith, and she gets scared in strange places. Watching him tend to the little girl, his daughter, her granddaughter, with such practiced care made Meredith's heart ache. He was still a child himself, yet he moved with the bone-deep weariness of someone who had shouldered adult responsibilities far too young. That night, as the others slept, Meredith sat at the small kitchen table with Bridges planning their next moves. They would need solid evidence to bring down Sister Darlene's operation and ensure the children's safety. I'll reach out to a contact at the FBI tomorrow, Bridges said, keeping his voice low. Someone I trust, but we need to be prepared for pushback. Cases like this, involving respected community figures, are always complicated. I don't care how complicated it is, Meredith replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. I've spent 15 years believing my son was dead. Now I find he's been exploited, abused, and forced to participate in the same criminal enterprise that stole him from me. There is no power on earth that will stop me from getting justice. Bridges studied her face in the dim light. And if justice means your son faces consequences too? If they argue he was involved, knew what was happening? The question hit her like a physical blow. He was a victim, she insisted. He was taken as a toddler, raised in that environment. He didn't know anything else. I agree, but prosecutors might see it differently, especially given his age now. They might claim he could have sought help, reported what was happening. Meredith's hands clenched into fists. Then we'll fight that battle too. I'm not losing him again. The following days brought a crushing reality Meredith hadn't anticipated. Her attempts to contact the FBI through Bridges' connections met with bureaucratic delays and vague promises of future interviews. Local media, when approached anonymously about investigating second-chance adoptions, showed little interest in what they viewed as unsubstantiated allegations against a respected charity. Even Meredith's considerable wealth and influence seemed to hit invisible barriers. Calls to political contacts went unreturned. Her attorney, after initially expressing outrage at her story, became increasingly cautious, warning of potential legal consequences if she continued making accusations without concrete evidence. The most devastating blow came a week after their escape, when Officer Daniels held a press conference in Cloverville, flanked by Sister Darlene. They announced the disappearance of 3 vulnerable children who had allegedly been kidnapped by a mentally unstable woman obsessed with replacing her long-dead son. Meredith watched the broadcast in horror as her name and photo were splashed across the screen, painting her as a dangerous kidnapper rather than a mother seeking justice. She's always been troubled, Sister Darlene told reporters, her face a perfect mask of Christian concern. After her son's tragic drowning 15 years ago, a drowning she refuses to accept, Meredith Vaughn has repeatedly harassed our organization, convinced that one of our adopted children is somehow her deceased son. We are asking anyone with information to come forward immediately, Officer Daniels added gravely. These children are in danger and need to be returned to their proper guardians. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. They were trapped, unable to seek help from authorities who had already branded them criminals, unable to return to their normal lives. And in the midst of this nightmare, Tommy withdrew further into himself, the tentative trust he'd begun to show crumbling under the weight of their deteriorating situation. You promised you could keep them safe, he accused Meredith one night after the younger children were asleep. But we're just hiding, and they're winning. In that moment, kneeling on the floor of a borrowed cabin, her son's accusations ringing in her ears and the world believing her to be a dangerous kidnapper, Meredith Vaughn hit rock bottom. Everything she had fought for, everything she had found, was slipping through her fingers like sand. But rock bottom, she would soon discover, was exactly where she needed to be to find the way forward. Dawn broke over the Blue Ridge Mountains with deceptive gentleness, painting the sky in delicate watercolor strokes of pink and gold. Inside the cabin, Meredith sat motionless at the kitchen table, an untouched cup of coffee growing cold between her palms. She hadn't slept. The accusations from Tommy, her son, her flesh and blood, yet still a stranger, had burrowed deep into her heart, poisonous barbs that refused to dislodge. "We're just hiding, and they're winning." He was right. Sister Darlene's masterful press conference had transformed Meredith from victim to villain in the public eye. The narrative was compelling in its simplicity. A wealthy, mentally unstable woman, unable to accept her child's death, had kidnapped 3 vulnerable children in a delusional attempt to recreate her lost family. Who wouldn't believe that tragic tale? The floorboards creaked softly behind her. Bridges appeared, his normally immaculate appearance rumpled from sleeping on the sofa. "You're thinking too loud," he observed, pouring himself coffee from the pot. Meredith didn't smile. "We can't stay here forever. Supplies are running low and the children need stability, medical care." She drew a deep breath. "I'm thinking of surrendering." Bridges' cup froze halfway to his lips. "That would be a mistake." "Would it? If I turn myself in, explain everything. You'll be arrested immediately," he interrupted. "The kids will be returned to Sister Darlene's custody while the courts sort things out, which could take months, even years. And during that time, those records Tommy mentioned, they'll disappear, along with any other evidence of what they've been doing." The stark assessment hung between them like a physical presence. Meredith closed her eyes, fighting against the despair threatening to consume her. "Then what? What's left?" A small voice answered from the doorway. "The truth." They turned to find Ellie standing there, her dark hair tangled from sleep but her eyes clear and determined. "We go back to where it all started," she continued, moving into the kitchen. "St. Catherine's Home for Children. The orphanage was shut down 15 years ago," Bridges pointed out. "The building is still there," Ellie countered. "Abandoned, condemned, but standing. And Sister Darlene, for all her careful planning, is superstitious. She wouldn't destroy evidence, she'd hide it. Somewhere she believes is safe." A grim smile touched her lips. Somewhere like the place that gave her power in the first place. A spark of hope ignited in Meredith's chest. "How can you be sure?" "Because I've been back," Ellie admitted. "After I aged out of foster care, I went looking for answers. The main offices were cleared out, but I found something in the basement. A room that wasn't on any building plans, with a padlocked door." "Did you get inside?" Bridges asked, fully alert now. Ellie shook her head. "I got spooked. But I remember where it is. And I'd bet anything that's where she keeps her insurance policies. Proof of everyone involved. Records she could use to protect herself if things ever went wrong." For the first time in days, Meredith felt something other than despair. "We need to go there." "It's risky," Bridges warned. "The place is probably watched." "It's the middle of nowhere," Ellie countered. "And everyone believes we've fled the state. It's our best shot." A soft shuffling sound drew their attention to Tommy, who stood in the hallway with Lily balanced on his hip. The little girl's blonde curls were tousled from sleep, her tiny fist clutching Tommy's t-shirt. "You're talking about St. Catherine's," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I remember it. Not much, but fragments. A room with green walls, a playground with a broken swing." He hesitated. "A lady who made me call her Mother Darlene instead of sister." Meredith's heart clenched painfully. Those fragmented memories were from when he was first taken, when he was still Tommy, not Jason, when he still remembered his real mother. "Would you recognize it if you saw it again?" she asked softly. Tommy's expression closed off. "Maybe. I don't know." He shifted Lily higher on his hip. "She needs breakfast." The conversation paused as they moved through the domestic ritual of feeding the children. Michael, still half asleep, pushed his cereal around the bowl while Lily babbled happily, unaware of the tension surrounding her. Tommy remained silent, methodically cutting a banana into tiny pieces for his daughter. It was Bridges who finally broke the uncomfortable silence. "If we're doing this, we need a plan. St. Catherine's is over 3 hours from here, back toward Cloverville." "I'll go," Ellie volunteered immediately. "I know the place, and no one's looking for me specifically." "Not alone," Meredith insisted. "I'm coming with you." "And the children?" Bridges challenged. The question hung unanswered as Tommy stood abruptly, carrying his plate to the sink. "There's an old chest in the bedroom," he said without turning around. "Wooden with carvings on it. I found it yesterday. It's full of stuff, kid stuff. Crayons, paper, some toys." The non sequitur confused them until he continued. I could Watch them, Michael and Lily, while you're gone." His shoulders were rigid with tension. "If you trust me with them." The offer, reluctantly given, represented the first real olive branch from Tommy since their escape. Meredith wanted to rush to him, to wrap him in her arms and tell him of course she trusted him. He was their protector, their guardian angel. But she restrained herself, recognizing his fragile pride. "We trust you completely," she said instead, keeping her voice steady. "But are you sure you want to stay here? You might remember something important at St. Catherine's." Tommy finally turned to face them, his expression unreadable. "I remember enough. And they're scared. They need consistency." The decision was made. Meredith, Bridges, and Ellie would make the journey to St. Catherine's while Tommy remained at the cabin with the children. They would leave at nightfall, drive with headlights off until they reached the main road, and approach the abandoned orphanage in the pre-dawn hours when the chances of being spotted were lowest. As they prepared, gathering flashlights and tools for breaking through the padlock Ellie had described, Meredith found herself drawn to the wooden chest Tommy had mentioned. It sat in the corner of the smaller bedroom, its surface carved with pine trees and mountains, a relic of some long-departed family's vacation memories. Inside, buried beneath coloring books and broken crayons, she discovered a stack of yellowed drawing paper. Curious, she lifted the top sheet and froze. The childish drawing showed a woman with long hair and a blue triangle dress, holding the hand of a small stick figure. Crude letters spelled out "Mama" across the top. Something about the drawing style tugged at her memory. With trembling hands, she set it aside and looked at the next one. A house with smoke coming from the chimney, a tree, a sun with rays like spider legs. It was eerily similar to the drawings Tommy had made as a toddler, the ones she'd preserved in a scrapbook that she couldn't bear to look at after his disappearance. On impulse, she gathered the drawings and returned to the main room where her purse sat. From a zippered compartment, she withdrew a small, worn leather wallet. Inside, preserved in plastic, was a folded piece of paper, the last drawing Tommy had made before he was taken, carefully maintained through 15 years of grief. It showed the same triangle-dressed woman, the same wobbly sun, the same distinctive way of coloring that pressed so hard the crayon sometimes tore through the paper. "What's that?" She startled at Tommy's voice. He stood in the doorway, watching her with a guarded expression. "Something I've carried with me every day since you disappeared," she answered truthfully, holding out the fragile drawing. "The last picture you made for me." Tommy hesitated before taking it, his fingers barely touching the plastic covering. He studied it for a long moment, his face betraying nothing. "I should finish packing," Meredith said when the silence grew too heavy, moving toward the door. "Wait." Tommy's voice stopped her. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper, creased and refolded so many times the creases had begun to tear. "I found this on the ground at the square, the day after I first saw you. Michael must have dropped it." He handed it to her, another drawing. This one newer, but with the same distinctive style as the ones in the chest. It showed a woman in blue and a child, but this time there were words scrawled in a child's uneven hand. "Mamãe, you took him frio. Você voltou?" Meredith's vision blurred with tears. The Portuguese phrase, the same one from the tape, the same one Tommy had said every night before bed as a toddler, written in a child's hand that wasn't Tommy's. "Michael remembers," Tommy said quietly. "He doesn't talk much because they punished him when he did, but he remembers the words. I don't know how, but he knows them." As the realization dawned, Meredith felt her knees weaken. "He's your brother," she whispered. "My son." They took him too. The implications crashed over her like a tsunami. Not one child stolen from her, but two. The missing pieces suddenly aligned. Michael's age, his resemblance to Tommy, the inexplicable bond between them that went beyond their shared circumstances. Tommy's face showed the first genuine emotion she'd seen from him. Confusion, disbelief, and somewhere beneath it all, a glimmer of hope. "That's why I couldn't leave him," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "From the first day they brought him to Second Chance, I felt, I don't know, connected. I thought I was crazy." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the cabin windows, mother and son stood facing each other across 15 years of separation, united by a child's drawing and words spoken across time. "Mommy, I'm cold. You came back." Sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single moment of recognition. A blue bracelet, A familiar pair of eyes, a mother's intuition that refuses to be silenced. Meredith's story reminds us that even in our darkest hours, when all hope seems lost and the world has moved on, the bonds of family can transcend time, distance, and the most sinister of intentions. What would you have done in her position? Would you have had the courage to trust your heart when everyone else told you to let go? The children who were stolen deserved justice, but more than that, they deserved to be seen, truly seen, for who they were beneath the lies and manipulation. In a world that too often looks away from uncomfortable truths, Meredith chose to stare directly into the darkness, refusing to blink until light was restored. Her journey teaches us that sometimes the most powerful act of love is simply showing up, day after day, never surrendering to despair even when the path forward seems impossible. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that some bonds can never truly be broken. Follow our channel for more powerful true stories that challenge us to reflect on what matters most in life. Like, comment, and let us know what part of Meredith's journey resonated most with you. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light, stories that remind us all of the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit.